Mats Lingblad here. Today I will speak about product market and sub-industry structure. The most important part of today's presentation is product market analysis. To do that properly, we need to understand what is an industry. I will use the case study Trafaco Choices for the Future written by myself throughout this presentation. It's not absolutely necessary for you to have read the case study, but it would help if you have read it. First, a little bit on external analysis. I will present two illustrations of the type of study you can conduct after completing this video. I don't expect you will understand the details now unless you have prior experience. Going back to 2011, the gaming craze was social network games, Farmville, Restaurant City, etc. Zynga was the market leader. How strong was its position? Well, the product category social video games had very little price competition. Buyers were actually buying in-game coins to improve their ranking in the games. Great. However, the market for social network services and distribution had even lower price competition. Zynga needed Facebook to get access to social network data, and Facebook almost had a monopoly for providing such data. At the time, Facebook did not charge full price because Facebook was interested in the traffic generated by Zynga. However, if Zynga could continue to attract more buyers, it would have had to give most of the profit away to Facebook. The share price of Zynga tanked 80% in 2012. The second example is a more recent one, cab hailing applications. Let's look at the US market. How defendable is Lyft's and Uber's position? Well, I would argue it's very defendable. A product market controlled by two companies should not have much price competition. However, Lyft's and Uber's current strategy is to grow the market by offering low prices. Once they get out of this silly idea, prices will increase and make both companies profitable. Sophisticated interaction between the two companies is what we expect once companies get used to each other. There will be absolutely no threat from the drivers. They have no power. This also applies if new regulation would consider drivers as employees. Whether Lyft's and Uber's share price is defendable is a different matter. What is clear is that they are companies with good positions in their respective product markets. Industries differ greatly in their attractiveness. The chart below shows the average yearly stock market return for a number of industries between 1930 and 2017, broken down into 3 time periods. The top performing industries have been tobacco, aircraft, and banking. If your great-grandparents invested $100 in 1930, it would today be worth $2.7 million if invested in the top 3 industries. If your great-grandparents were unlucky enough to invest in steel, coal, and real estate, the holding would only be worth $25,000 today. The cumulative effect of different return rates is indeed staggering. The patterns are not totally stable over time. Real estate was bad in the 30s, but good in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. The patterns are durable, but they do change and break. The previous data from the stock market reflect both profitability and growth. High industry profit requires balancing profitability and growth. This is often forgotten due to the enormous popularity of Michael Porter's 5 forces model. Profitability is measured by product market competition assessment or Porter's 5 forces. Growth is measured by the product category life cycle. The focus of this video will be on profitability. Growth will be discussed in another video. The objective of industry analysis is to understand emerging opportunities and threats. Industry analysis focuses on structural factors influencing product price and product quality. Structure consists of both tangible factors like market shares and intangible factors like communication schemas. Structure is often reproduced even when executives are unaware of the pattern or do not desire its reproduction. Industry analysis makes it possible to forecast the future. Structure changes slowly, so trends tend to persist. When structure changes fast, for instance by deregulation, higher tariffs, or the availability of a superior new raw material, price and quality changes can be predictable. Industry analysis makes it possible for companies to then take proactive or reactive action. This backup slides illustrates a few examples of why industry analysis is highly relevant today. If interested, read at your leisure. What is an industry? Let's have a look. Industries are too aggregated for industry analysis. Let's have a look at semiconductor manufacturing industry. It consists of several sub-industries like logic integrated circuits, analog digital conversion devices, memory chips, freestanding transistors, optoelectronics, and sensors. The sub-industries can also be broken down into various product categories, like general purpose microprocessors, graphics processors, etc. The same is true for all industries. The second examples give an illustration from motor manufacturing, breaking down vehicles into passenger cars, small trucks, heavy trucks, and motorcycles. In this presentation, the term industry will still be used as shorthand for sub-industry, product category, and product market. The unit of analysis issue creates huge complications for industry analysis. We need to look at 3 different scopes to properly understand the issue: horizontal scope, vertical scope, and geographic scope. Horizontal scope we already looked at, and I said it's better to look at the sub-industry level than the industry level. Sometimes it could also be helpful to look at the product market. Vertical scope. Any stage in the industry supply chain intermediated by a market can be the unit of analysis. And finally, geographic scope. The geographic area of buyers' purchases determines the unit of analysis. Let's just look at one example before we go into the details. Television sets. On the left, we have retailing. On the right, we have manufacturing. Some retailers are focused on television sets, but more often they are merged with other kind of products like white goods. This is the horizontal scope issue. Some retailers are just doing retailing. Other retailers are part of chains which also do wholesaling activities. Here we're getting into vertical scope. And finally, retailing tends to be a local activity. We don't travel far to buy a new television. Let's look at manufacturing of the same television sets. The manufacturers also produce computer screens. That's horizontal scope issue. The vertical scope issue is how much of the components that goes into the LCD screen is actually produced internally by the same company. And finally, geographic scope. There are 3 companies in the world that dominate production of television sets. They sell their units all around the globe. So from the producer's perspective, the market for television sets is global. But as we saw from the buyer's perspective, the market for television sets is highly local. These are the complications we have to dig into before we start industry analysis proper. We will start looking at horizontal scope. Horizontal scope can be based on technology or buyer needs. The standard way to classify the economy is to look at similarities in transformation technologies, that is, production technology and distribution technology. The economy can be broken down into sectors, like manufacturing, mining, agriculture, professional services, and real estate. Further down, we have industries, motor vehicle manufacturing, semiconductor manufacturing, electrical component manufacturing. Sub-industry is the next level of disaggregation. Here we could have passenger cars, heavy lorries, or two-wheelers. Further down we get into product categories. The best way to think about a product category is the set of products that fulfill the same basic function for the users. So a BMW 7 Series and the Toyota Corolla have very different price levels, but the basic function of those two cars is the same. It's the same product category. Traditionally, we are using this classification system to do industry analysis. It's preferably to do industry analysis at a sub-industry level, but the product category level is also possible. The industry level is not good because it's too aggregate and it's hard to find anything interesting to say at that high level of aggregation. The second way to classify economic activity is to look at similarity of buyer needs. This is a bottom-up process starting with individual products and aggregate them up based on the similarities of the needs they fulfill. The product market is here a central concept. The product market consists of all the products fulfilling the same essential function, the same need, irrespective of whether they are produced using the same or different transformation technologies. So in many cases, product category and product market will be identical. There is correspondence, and that makes analysis very easy. But in many and more frequently, product markets consist of multiple product categories. Let's continue with our example from passenger cars. We can now make electric vehicles as well as internal combustion engine vehicles. These are different product categories because they use different production technology, but they fulfill exactly the same essential function for the buyer, so they are part of the same product market. Product market is a good way to analyze. Is a good way to analyze substitutes. It's sometimes also useful to look at the product market section. What is that? Within the product market, there could be different specifications of the products that are more important than individual product specifications. For instance, in passenger cars, we have pickup trucks, sedan models, and SUV models. These three different kinds of cars have the same essential function, but they also have some additional characteristics. The pickup truck can take more load, and the SUV might have a four-wheel drive. These are important characteristics for some customers, but overall, we can still consider all of these as substitutes. Hence, they belong to the same product market, but we consider them product market sections. We can do industry analysis at the product market level as well as the product market section level. Let's move over to the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry consists of several sub-industries. Generic modern drug manufacturers buy active pharmaceutical ingredients from manufacturers. Hence, they don't do any R&D on their own. They basically make pills and capsules. It is then possible to consider all generic modern medicine as one sub-industry. This is not possible for modern medicine, which is still under patent. Different therapeutic classes like antibiotics, painkiller, cancer drugs, and so on cannot easily be substituted. There are decades of knowledge built up with specific companies for specific therapeutic classes. Hence, it's proper to consider each therapeutic class as a sub-industry. Finally, the traditional medicine uses age-old knowledge to produce pills. Because they don't have any proprietary knowledge, it is also possible to consider the traditional medicine industry as one sub-industry. Most drugs produced in Vietnam are either generic modern drugs or traditional drugs. This makes our analysis easier because we can disregard all those patented modern drugs, which are just imported to Vietnam. Before getting into the model, I want to again emphasize the distinction between the product market perspective and the sub-industry. Let's take an air transportation example. Going back to the 1970s, aircraft manufacturers sold aircraft to airlines, who operated and ran routes. In the 1980s, leasing companies emerged, selling dry leases, which is the airframe with or without seats. This gave more flexibility to the airlines because they could more flexibly change their fleet. Later, we also got wet leases, which is a plane with the pilot and a crew. So you lease the whole thing. And with the growth of the industry, we got a vibrant second-hand market in used aircraft. This level of complexity is common today. How to deal with it? My preferred perspective is the product market perspective. We can talk about a physical aircraft market and an aircraft services market. The physical aircraft market has suppliers of new aircraft and old aircraft. The aircraft services market have different offerings. We can buy the whole thing from the wet lease operator. We can buy the flexibility from a dry lease operator, or we can buy the aircraft and hire staff ourselves. This is different offerings in the aircraft services market. The sub-industry perspective would mean that we understand and study each industry separately. The product market perspective uses the idea of an essential function that all product categories in the product market has. The sub-industry perspective requires us to do one analysis per sub-industry, and we can get into a tricky discussion about substitutes. The good thing is, if we start with product categories, both analyses can be made using the same data. We can aggregate product categories into product markets or into sub-industries. If we had data, a better choice to understand competition would be the product market. Unfortunately, the data is lacking in the case for this type of study. The product market for improving cognitive function would include many different product categories: generic modern drugs like caffeine, patented modern drugs like modafinil, traditional Western medicine like ginkgo biloba, or the equivalent in Vietnam, Din Lang, or even functional food could possibly improve our cognitive function. All of these product categories compete in the product market for drugs enhancing our cognitive function. And the second example with painkillers: generic modern painkillers, patented modern painkillers, and traditional drugs that can function as a painkiller. We will not proceed along these lines today because we lack data, but it would have been a worthwhile exercise. Vertical scope. Let's move over to vertical scope. The economy can be seen as a network. In this simple model, I have highlighted the three most important relationships between various sectors of the economy. At this very high level of aggregation, it already looks quite complex. So before analysis, we need to linearize a small part of the economy. Most interesting industry dynamics takes place inside each transformation dyad. But before we look inside the transformation dyad, we need to look at the whole industry supply chain. The focus of this presentation will be drug manufacturing and distribution. What are the other steps in the industry supply chain? Well, we got raw materials, chemicals and plants that produce active ingredients. We have an end consumer. In some cases, drugs are sold to hospitals before they reach the end consumer. And we have intermediary products like machinery for pill and capsule production. Between the transformation dyads, we can do industry analysis, but we often find quite efficient markets between dyads due to many buyers and sellers. And it's difficult for companies to influence adjacent dyads. So more interesting analysis can be done within each transformation dyad. Inside each dyad are normally multiple sub-industries with varying profitability. It's easier for companies to influence their own dyad. So let's look into the drug manufacturing and distribution dyad. There are several activities in the drug manufacturing and distribution dyad intermediated by markets. First, I make a distinction between traditional and modern drug manufacturing. Then I look at the suppliers, dried and ground plants, active ingredients in a powder format, as well as machinery that goes into producing pills and capsules. I also look at distribution, which consists of distributors as well as pharmacies. It's important to rearrange activities so value flow is tracked, or the reverse money flow, instead of the physical flow. The physical flow goes from manufacturer to distributor to pharmacy. But the value flow is different. The distributor does not take ownership of the goods. Instead, it sells distribution services to the drug manufacturers. Hence, distributors are a supplier to the drug manufacturers. In contrast, pharmacies take ownership of the goods, and they are the true customer of the drug manufacturers. Generic drug manufacturers only do a little bit of development and no research. Sometimes they buy this from contract development organizations. We need to do some simplifications for the analysis. We'll cover 5 markets in full: dried herbs, traditional drugs, generic modern drugs, distribution services, and retailing of drugs to individuals. Plants and active pharmaceutical ingredients will only be covered as input markets. Buyer segments requiring different transformation processes should be treated separately. If sellers can sell all buyers using the same transformation technology, all buyers should be grouped together. It's often necessary to distinguish between corporate buyers and individual buyers because distribution is often different. Corporate buyers in different industries also often buy different product categories, warranting separate analyses at the product category level. Alternatively, a joint analysis at the sub-industry level. It's also interesting to study the more detailed product market segment or product market section level, but then we need to be aware that structural analysis is less relevant. Company strategy is very important at this level, and it's only partially determined by structure. Let's look at the passenger car examples. The manufacturers need to distinguish between sales going to end consumers and sales to car rental, taxi, and leasing companies. Passenger cars to end consumers can be treated as one product market, but it's also possible to do more detailed analysis. Different product market sections. Sports utility vehicles, vehicles that can carry up to 8 people, people carriers, sports cars, or different product market segments like luxury cars, high-end, middle market, and low-end. At this more detailed level, we get into definitional issues: exactly what is a sports utility vehicle, how is it different from a sedan car, and do the buyers really make a distinction between sports utility vehicle and sedan cars? What's the middle market and what's the high end? What happens if one company does different models ranging from middle market to high end to luxury? How do we deal with this? These are important distinctions that needs to be made when we do detailed competitor analysis. So here is an example of how we can use industry analysis to understand different geographical markets in the airline industry. Airlines can experience anything from low to high rivalry, as we'll see, but in general, buyers do not have much power. East Asian long-distance routes have the lowest amount of rivalry. This is mainly driven by few competitors due to regulated entry. The domestic US market has also relatively low rivalry, and here the cause is a recent consolidation of the market into a few giant companies. Southeast Asia to Europe has the highest amount of price competition in all markets, and this is due to a multitude of factors: a large number of companies that come from very different backgrounds that have a hard time communicating informally with each other. Geographic scope. Buyers ultimately determine the geographic size of the market. On the vertical axis in the chart, we have the geographic market considered by typical buyers. This could range from a neighborhood market all the way up to a global market. An example of a neighborhood market is a supermarket. And an example of a global market is the market for uncut diamonds. Consumer goods markets often have a smaller geographic size than industrial goods markets. That does not mean all consumer markets are neighborhood markets. If we are looking for home insurance, we are perfectly willing to call a call center that's located anywhere within the national market. And when ordering products online, we might consider the world region or the global market. It's important to keep the geographic scope of the market in mind when we draw the industry supply chain. Geographic size of the market can shift over time due to changes in information costs, transformation costs, and changing trade barriers. When Michael Porter first wrote about industry analysis in the 1970s, the US had been one integrated production region for some time, so for him the size of the geographic market was less important. On the horizontal axis, we have the number of geographic markets in which a company is present. In region A, analysis will be very resource intensive because each market has different competitors. The typical company is only present in one market. That is perfectly fine in a global market or a world regional market, but very problematic in a neighborhood market. In region B, analysis is easier because each market has the same competitors. We will now discuss a practical method to define geographic scope of the market. Let's look at how we can deal with geographical scope from a practical standpoint. We have three different ways of dealing with the problem. First, brute force. We analyze all markets separately. Resource constraints normally make this impossible unless we are looking at global or world regions, or possibly a more narrow geographical scope. The second option is to aggregate markets before we analyze. We aggregate narrower geographical markets under the condition that the same competitors have an active presence in all geographical markets. Let's take the example of television sets that are bought in electronic shops, which are city markets. That could potentially lead to a lot of multiplication in analysis because we have thousands of city markets in the world. However, 43% of all television sets in the world are produced by 3 East Asian companies, so there will be a lot of commonality. If we then find the same companies competing in each city market, we can aggregate them to the regional market. If we there find the same companies, we can also aggregate to the national market. We can continue aggregation as long as the same competitors meet in each of the lower level geographical scope market. However, we need to be careful with specialized producers. In the US market, there's one company, Vizio, that has the second largest market share. Since it's only present in the US market, it would not make sense to aggregate the television set market to the world regional market because we are then losing the data from the US market. The fact that we have a different company as number 2 in the big US market is significant, and if we aggregate data too much, we will lose that information. And this unique information is generally what makes industry analysis relevant and interesting. So in the case of television sets, we can aggregate to the national market level, but probably we have to stop there. Finally, if it's not possible to aggregate because there are many different companies present in the different markets, we just have to settle by analyzing a sample of markets. We could, for instance, disregard smaller geographical markets, or we could study a more representative selection of markets to get an understanding of the range of competitive structures within the broader market. Most data are only available at the national level, making it necessary to make a number of assumptions, as well as be aware of the limitations in the dataset. There are both national and regional manufacturers and distributors. The regional distributors are present in one or a few regions. This means that their market share, when measured at the national level, will be underestimated. A national market share for a regional company of, say, 2% might be equivalent to a 10% market share in the specific region the regional company is present. This is a limitation in the data that we need to keep in mind. The situation for the pharmacies is more difficult. There are more than 50,000 independent pharmacies in Vietnam, and there are hardly any chain pharmacies. This means that different companies meet each other in each neighborhood market for pharmacy services. If it's a big city, there will be more pharmacies competing than in a smaller village. All this variety is lost because we lack data. The data for raw material are either national or world regional, and in this case focus on the Vietnamese market alone would be limiting from the other side. All these limitations and lack of data means that the most interesting results will remain hidden to us, but hopefully we'll still have some interesting findings. I will present three different choices for analyzing competition in an industry. The quick method is a simplified assessment of price competition alone. The objective is to understand when a product market enters an area of especially low or especially high price competition. The method can be used to screen multiple markets quickly, and separate analysis is made on each input market as well as output product markets. The product market competition model is a full version of the quick method. Here the objective is a detailed understanding of price competition as well as quality competition. This is especially useful when price competition is at the moderate level and the quick method does not give a conclusive result. By being more complete, the product market competition model is more suited for a long-term assessment of competition. Finally, the five forces model, which has been around since invention in 1978. Here the objective is to understand industry attractiveness, i.e. profitability. The framework requires more experience from the analyst to distinguish between more and less important subfactors. The five forces each have 10 or so subfactors, so there will be a large number of subfactors to take into account. When doing five forces analysis with MBA students, it's very typical that there is a uniform distribution for many of the forces. That is, some students say forces high, others say forces low, and a third of the class says, oh, it's somewhere in between. The five forces model is good once you have done it 20, 30 times and gained an understanding of the detailed intricacies. Price competition is normally much worse than product attribute competition. Let's look at the situation with little competition. We managed to increase our revenue by increasing prices from 100 to 105. Our cost remains the same and profit grows to 15. This is the beauty of a market with low degree of competition. Enter price competition. We lower our price to 95, hoping to gain more customers. However, our competitors also lower their prices to 95, so both of us ending up earning less. We still have costs of 90 and profit is down to 5. Compare this to price quality competition. We do product innovation or advertising, increase our price to 105, but also have a higher cost structure. Our profit is 10, if successful. If the innovation is unsuccessful, we still have a revenue of 100, but a higher cost of 95, and a profit of 5. All companies in the industry can end up being better off with product quality competition. That is not the case with price competition. Nobody wants price competition, but that is the natural outcome when you have more than 12 competitors, making up 60% of the market. There are different competitive regimes based on the concentration levels in an industry. Let's start by looking at the supply side, the suppliers, the sellers, and we want to look at the number of companies needed to reach 60% of sales in the market. Note that the scale is logarithmic, so here we have 10 companies, 100 plus companies, and 1 company. On the vertical axis, we have number of buyers needed to account for 60% of purchases. Again, a logarithmic scale. There are different ways of measuring concentration in an industry. Economists like to use the 4-factor concentration ratio or the Herfindahl index. I prefer to count number of companies needed to reach 60% of the market. Why 60%? Well, it is somewhat of an arbitrary number, but by capturing 60% of the market, we capture most important companies. It could be useful to say 80% of the market, but generally it's very difficult to identify smaller companies from 60 to 80%. So rather than trying to spend a lot of energy in identifying companies from 60 to 80%, I'm saying stay with 60% and identify all companies by name that are smaller and that are needed to account for the 60% of sales and purchases. Now, let's look at the different regimes that this chart gives us. Price competition begins in earnest around 3 companies and reaches a high level around 12 companies and stays there. So whether you have 12 or 100 companies, you can expect high price competition. And again, remember, these are companies covering 60% of the market. So 12 companies means that there are more than 12 companies in the market. Product quality competition is anything that has to do with changing, improving product attributes. Product attributes are characteristics of the core functionality of the product, as well as the extended product, like service level associated with the purchase, branding, and warranties, etc. This begins even with 1 company and reaches a high around 6 companies, and then it starts to decline when price competition takes hold. If we have a lot of competitors in the industry, chances are high we're going to see very little product quality competition. At the intermediate levels of concentration, then between 3 and 12 companies, we will have both price and product quality competition. If there are less than around 8 buyers and sellers, we get into something called mutual bargaining on price and product quality. And it's difficult to say the outcome of this because it is a bargaining process between powerful sellers and powerful buyers, and we need to look into detail to understand this small numbers game. Finally, let's just look at economic theory, and many of you have heard about monopoly, oligopoly, and perfect competition. Monopoly is to the far left here. Remember that even one seller means that there could be other companies making up to 40% of the market. Perfect competition, economist says it happens when we have many companies. In theory, an infinite amount of companies, but in practice, many, meaning, say, 60, 70 companies. We also have something called monopsony, that is one buyer and many sellers. Most of economic theory on the basic level does not deal with the remaining part of this chart, which is the oligopoly. In the 1980s, economists tried to use game theory to understand competition under oligopoly. Unfortunately, the result was that anything is possible, and it depends on the assumptions. So we can get high price competition, we can get high product quality competition, or we can get low of either. It all depends on the assumptions. So not very helpful at all. To deal with the oligopoly question, the full model that I will present shortly will deal with the most important factors to understand whether we'll get product quality or price competition. The presentation will now start to get denser. Unfortunately, there is no way around it. First, we're going to look at the quick method, and then the full method, and then a brief overview of Porter's 5 forces. Please stay with me. The quick method can identify strong and weak price competition regimes. It is less suited for understanding middle-of-the-road situations as well as product quality competition. Rivalry is assessed by market power, which is defined as the number of companies needed to reach 60% of sales in an industry. Buyer power is identified as strong negotiation power, and that is determined by the ratio between number of sellers to reach 60% and number of buyers to reach 60% of combined purchases. Let's look at an example. Rivalry is assessed by calculating number of sellers to reach 60% of sales in a market. It's important to be clear about scope. Distribution and manufacturing has both national and regional companies. Here I've listed a number in a typical region: 5 to 7 traditional drug manufacturers, 15 to 20 modern generic drug manufacturers, and 4 to 5 distributors. When calculating the distribution services market, it's important to note that traditional modern generic as well as modern patented drugs buy distribution services. So that is the relevant market. Pharmacy is a local market within a short motorcycle ride. And I have assumed there are around 20 pharmacies in each local market. Drying and grinding is mostly national, and there are around 10 such companies in Vietnam. Active ingredients is a worldwide market. Number of producers per product category has been listed and can vary between 4 to 15. To assess the degree of rivalry, we can use the following table. If we have 1 to 2 companies, rivalry is low. More than 12 companies, rivalry can be assumed to be high. In between, we need to do further analysis. We can already see that the pharmacy market and the modern generic drug market is likely to have high rivalry. Strong negotiation power, which is the most important aspect of buyer power, is assessed by number of sellers to reach 60% divided by buyers to get to 60%. We need to calculate the number of suppliers within the buyer's consideration set and be sure to include all buying sub-industries. What does this mean? Well, the end consumer would consider pharmacies in his locality. I have assumed there are 20 such pharmacies. We relate 20 to the size of the market, around 10,000 individuals, and get a ratio 0.002. In contrast, active ingredients is a worldwide market, and I have assumed on average 7 companies to make up 60% of the typical sales in a product category. Modern generic is regional in Vietnam. So we need to compare apples with apples. I have assumed there are around 200 modern generic drug manufacturers in the world needed to make up 60% of the purchases of a typical product category. On the traditional side, drying and grinding is a national market, 10 companies divided by 6 traditional drug manufacturers, giving us a ratio of 1.7. The situation is different on the farming of the herb side. That's a regional market. Farmers up in the highlands are growing plants and only selling to drying and grinding companies within their own region. So 1,000 farmers divided by 2 drying and grinding companies within the region gives us a ratio of 500. Traditional drug manufacturing and modern drug manufacturing is regional, so we need to relate this to the number of pharmacies within each region, around 4,000, giving a ratio in the case of traditional of 0.002. Distribution services are sold equally to traditional and modern generic, and we need to take both into account when we calculate the ratio. 5 distributor divided by around 25 manufacturers. The amount of strong negotiation power is determined by the following table. If the ratio is above 2, the buyer has some to all power. In this case, the market for plants, the buyer has a lot of power. If the ratio is below 0.2, the buyer will have none to some power. And the buyers of pharmacy products, the buyers from the manufacturers have none to some power, because the ratio is very small. We have, in some cases, the middle of middle category as well. It is sometimes difficult to know the number of companies, but that only becomes a critical component if the ratio is close to the cutoff points. So in the case of plants, the ratio is 500. It wouldn't matter that much even if there would be 5 drying and grinding companies within each region. On the pharmacy side, I have calculated around 10,000 individuals per local market, but the ratio would still be much lower than 0.2, even if I calculate with 1,000 or 100,000 customers per local market. Here are the main results from the quick analysis. We can expect high price competition in modern generic as well as in pharmacies, and less price competition in traditional and distribution. Any company contemplating entering modern generic and pharmacy businesses must think very carefully about having a lower cost than its competitors. Distribution and drying and grinding is close to the mutual bargaining area. A win-win mindset is critical to win in this region. Traditional has less price competition, but more product quality competition. Hence, strategy must deal with product innovation. Otherwise, a risk that the sub-industry moves into high price competition territory. In practice, that would mean that more companies without a uniquely differentiated product would enter traditional and push the industry towards high price competition. The remaining forces in the 5 forces model are dealt with in different ways. Supplier power. Input product markets are analyzed in the same way as output product markets. They are basically the same. The perspective is different though. More on that on next slide. New entrants. Assume that new entry is relatively easy. We have many new technologies, globalization, deregulation, availability of funding that has made new entry much easier. The full model will deal specifically with entry barriers. Substitutes. With the sub-industry focus, the right way to think about substitutes is that they will reduce growth, but not necessarily profitability in the sub-industry. Substitutes are important, but we need to use product category life cycles to understand their importance. We cannot do that with industry structural analysis. With the product market focus, substitutes are all included in the product market definition, so they are dealt with in a more thorough way by basically saying there are a lot of different products, we can call them substitutes, competing in a product market on an equal footing. Again, supplier power is simply supplier rivalry plus focal industry buyer power. We saw the importance of stringing the analysis together in the Zynga case. Zynga's product market has low price competition, but so does the input market for distribution and social network data. The only problem is that Zynga is at the losing end of that low price competition. They have to pay high prices. Looking at the previous analysis, we can look at the supply chain of traditional drugs. Here I have color-coded who gets a share in the profit pool. The traditional drug manufacturers and the distributors are the winners, and the plant farmers are the losers. The ultimate source of income is the pharmacy. Will they do everything to sell more? And is the farmers the ultimate source of value? And what is the fairness in them not making any share of the profit? Those are interesting questions raised by the analysis. We are now ready to take on the full model. We'll start with rivalry and buyer power to understand price competition. Then we'll have a section on vertical integration, which is a common phenomenon in most industry supply chains. Finally, we'll end with product quality competition, which is the second type of competition introduced earlier. Price competition is a joint effect of rivalry and buyer power. Here's a preview of the full results. Modern generic and drying and grinding will have high price competition. High price competition means that prices will be close to economic cost. It does not necessarily mean that prices will be low, but it generally tends to mean that prices will be low. Technically, it's the gap between economic cost and the price that is going to be small. Pharmacies have less price competition than in the quick analysis because the buyers have lower power. Traditional and distribution come out quite well with a low amount of price competition, meaning higher profit margins. Structural analysis provides a benchmark, but bad management can always increase price competition inadvertently. It's possible that a manager in traditional and distribution do not understand the source of their profit and decide to increase their profit by, for instance, lowering prices to gain market share. That is not what we should expect given the low amount of rivalry, but it's possible that bad management takes any kind of action. So we need to be aware that structural analysis tells us something about the potential. It doesn't say exactly what will happen in an industry. The full model goes into depth, which is especially helpful when making long-term forecasts, but also when a more thorough analysis is needed. Rivalry. A clear pecking order. We have now looked at the number of sellers to reach a cumulative 60% of the market. In the full model, we'll introduce a few additional factors. Sophisticated interaction is the second main category. Entry barriers, the third main category. And finally, a low temptation to renege on any implicit or explicit agreement among the competitors. Buyer power, we have already looked at strong negotiation power, to which we will add sophisticated interaction, high product differentiation, low information and knowledge, and high switching costs. The latter three categories have in common that they reduce price sensitivity. And low price sensitivity means low buyer power. A pecking order facilitates coordination in a sub-industry. All companies know their place. Here are a number of factors that are important for understanding the pecking order. First, the existence of a market leader. An operating definition of market leader is having more than 30% of the market and being double the size of the second largest company. Smaller companies will then pay heed to the market leader and let the market leader deal with critical decisions like pricing and capacity in the industry. No company is in the position to challenge the largest company if it is very big. Of course, the market leader must be willing to accommodate other companies and cannot go for the kill. The smaller companies will get desperate and might engage in price competition if the market leader wants the whole market. The second factor is a large first tier, and we are now talking about the three largest companies in the industry. Each of these companies stand to lose a large market share, so they will have a conservative outlook. They will try to avoid price competition and often also product quality competition, but that is mainly due to inertial forces. If there is a large first tier, they can tend to get quite complacent and lazy. A large first tier is normally highly correlated with the number of competitors required to reach a cumulative 60% market share, so we can use either of these two measures to understand the large market, the large first tier. The third factor is a small second tier, and the operating definition is company from 4 to 10, so 7 companies. If they are collectively small, they have no ability to challenge the first tier. If they are large, there will be multiple challengers among the second tier. Some second tier companies have fallen from the first tier and might want to reduce their prices to get back into the first tier. Others, having joined from the fringe tier through successful novel strategies, will try their luck against the first tier. Why stop a successful strategy? They will basically continue and try to aim for the first tier. It is helpful to use 7 companies here because it gives the analyst a benchmark, a feeling for how industries differ. There is nothing magical with including 7 companies, but the truth lies around there. Finally, the fringe tier is the remaining companies, and since it is the residual, it has no additional impact on competition that isn't captured by the other factors. However, a large fringe tier will lead to higher prices due to lack of economies of scale. So a large fringe tier, there will be a lot of competition, price competition, but prices will still be high because costs are high. This is an important fact when industries consolidate, because price is set by the marginal producer, and consolidating companies with a clear strategy can take advantage of the high price by reducing their own costs but not reducing the price correspondingly. So they will be very profitable as long as the fringe tier has a substantial size. Once the fringe tier market share declines and goes into the second tier, suddenly the situation is different because the second tier companies can start price competition in a way that the fringe tier companies cannot do. An easy visual way to understand the concept is to rank all the companies and plot their market share. Here I have used data from the case study and ranked 4 sub-industries based on declining market share. So the data is cumulative and should be interpreted in the following way. The first tier is large in distribution, 58% combined market share of the top 3 companies. It's also quite large in traditional, 48%. Modern generic and pharmacies have much smaller first tiers. Market leader. There is a clear market leader in distribution. It is almost 7 times the size of the second largest company. Traditional is getting close to a market leader status, but the leading company Trafaco is not yet there. Second tier. It is strong in modern generic, is actually larger than the first tier. It's also strong in pharmacies, but in the case of pharmacies, it's strong because all companies are very small, and since 7 companies are included in the second tier, they will always be larger than the first tier. So what are the consequences? Vina Farm is clear market leader in distribution. The first tier is large, the second tier is small. We can expect a low amount of rivalry in the distribution sub-industry. Traditional is quite concentrated, but Trafaco does not reach market leader status. The second tier is relatively weak, which is good for rivalry. That means the rivalry is going to be less. Modern generic is more fragmented, which is bad, and has a large second tier, which is also bad. The market leader DHG Pharma does not have market leader status, so it's unlikely that the competitors will look at DHG and pay heed to what they are doing. The smaller companies, the second tier, the remaining first tier companies will do their own thing, and that is likely to be price competition. Pharmacies are very fragmented and there is no market leader. This means that there is no pecking order to talk about and everyone is out for their own. Sophisticated interaction between competitors can further reduce rivalry. Companies can learn to interpret competitors' actions and signal to each other. This can be both legal and illegal. It's legal to publish a price list that shows recommended high prices and then signal that only quantity discounts are given to buyers. This is in effect saying to competitors, we will not engage in any price competition. It would, however, be illegal for the same competitors to meet and have that discussion in the open, or indeed in a smoke-filled room. A lot of communication, a lot of signaling can be done at the legal level. This is facilitated by practical knowledge of how the competitors tend to react. So companies that have interacted with each other over decades will have an advantage. They've done some mistakes in miscommunicating and have learned to see and interpret what the competitor is doing. We are talking decades, and 2-3 decades is probably necessary to get into really sophisticated interaction. Above 3 decades will probably not improve the situation because there is turnover of personnel and so on, and 30 years is pretty much one career. Companies located in countries belonging to the same world culture will find it easier to communicate with each other. Companies will find it even easier if they are in the same region in a big country, or in the same country if we are talking about a world region with many different countries. And even easier is it if they are all located in the same city. In that case, there might be a high turnover of people moving from the different companies. The different executives might have children in the same schools, and they might meet under such circumstances at on their spare time. So large movement of employees between companies also make it easier to do sophisticated interaction. Sophisticated interaction is slowly developing between many of the Vietnamese companies. To start with, we should say that all the companies are Vietnamese, so they share a common language and a common culture. Even though Vietnam is a large and many ways mountainous country, so there will be differences between the major regions in the country. Let's look at some details. Manufacturing the largest companies have interacted with each other for several decades. And as I mentioned, the cultural similarity is there. However, we need to take into account that the leading companies often don't have a large market share, so they have, because of the many companies present in the industry, not been able to develop sophisticated interaction. The number of potential interactions is very different if you have 15 relatively large companies or only 2-3 relatively large companies. Distribution is a case where we have 2-3 relatively large companies. So there we can see potentially more sophisticated interaction developing. But we need to bear in mind there that there is also several regional distributors, and distribution is very much an administrative function and not run on purely commercial grounds. There is one fully state-owned market leader, for instance, in distribution. So the amount of sophisticated interaction is still relatively low. At the pharmacy level, we can probably expect a bit more sophisticated interaction. Why? Well, first of all, pharmacies are often family-run businesses. So they've been around for a long time. They've coexisted in the same street or in the same village for a long time, and they probably found a way to avoid price competition in many cases. But it's easy to enter the industry, so definitely there will also be new pharmacies that might have different approaches. There's also another level of cultural similarity in the pharmacy business, and that is based on the university education of the owners. They all have, or most of them have, a pharmacy degree, which gives them a commonality of understanding, which makes it easier to engage in sophisticated interaction. Entry barriers reduce rivalry, but are generally rare. Low entry barriers have a policing effect on existing companies. There will be a little bit more price competition to avoid new entrants entering the market if the entry barriers are low. But the threat of entry is a weaker policing mechanism than actual having an entrant. Actual entry should be dealt with when doing forecasting of the future number of competitors, and that will influence the pecking order. Most product markets do not have entry barriers, but only barriers to enter specific positions of the product market. So genuine entry barriers must restrict entry to most positions in the market. Industrial organization economists have identified long lists of entry barriers, like brands, access to distribution channels, economies of scale. These are not entry barriers, but barriers to enter into a specific position in the marketplace. Entry barriers must do more than stopping startup companies from entering. Entrants can be existing companies in adjacent markets, either horizontal, vertical, upstream or downstream, or in other geographic areas. A company might have a fully developed production process in another country, and it could be relatively easy for that company to enter a new country, either by replicating the production or simply by exporting. Entrants can also be new companies, but then often with a novel strategy. For instance, manufacturing can be outsourced to a Chinese company, and the company focuses instead on product design and marketing. So there are many ways of entering a market, so don't have the specific de novo entrant in mind, somebody wanting to build up a position that already exists in the marketplace. So there are only two genuine entry barriers. First, when When a high market share is required for break-even, entry becomes less likely. So we make a calculation of all non-recoverable investments, that is sunk costs, as well as operating costs to reach the required scale. And we can assume that we should enter in a cost-efficient way. An interesting example of entry barriers and market share required is Comac, a Chinese company developing a competitor to Airbus A320 and Boeing 737. The company has spent around $15 billion developing the product, and back of the envelope calculation of the break-even market share puts it around 27%. That is very high. Considering that 20% of all aircraft is currently purchased by Chinese airlines, it's possible that Comac will be profitable in the long term. But if we have a requirement of 27% market share for break-even, we generally can expect that to be a high entry barrier, unless, of course, there's a strategic reason for government to get involved and support a specific project. The second factor we need to take into account is legal restrictions, making entry difficult or, in the extreme, impossible. Two typical ways to do this is tariffs that makes the cost of import more expensive, and difficult to get licenses. We want to single these out because they can change very quickly. A medallion needed to operate a New York City licensed taxi cab costed around $500,000 in 2010. Today, the price is just a fraction, so regulation can change. In the European Union, it's easy to get a license for international passenger flights. In China, it's currently impossible to get a similar license. In Southeast Asia, licenses are issued more liberally, but only then to companies with at least 50% national ownership. So industries linked to governments, and especially in developing countries, will have legal restrictions that protect the existing companies. In the US market, no foreign airline is allowed to operate. In the US domestic market, no foreign airline is allowed to operate. That helps the domestic airlines' profitability. And in terms of telecom equipment, there are a lot of safety issues relating to espionage, making the Huawei products banned in the US and some European countries. Entry barriers in the Vietnamese context. Traditional and modern. The break-even market share is low. We can buy second-hand equipment for as little as $50,000, and we can even resell that equipment if our business would fail. We buy active ingredients from a company in China or India. Legal restrictions. It's simple to register a pharmaceutical company, so that's not an issue, but there are tariffs on imported product protecting the industry from cheap import of generic medicine from, say, China. So entry barriers, low to medium. Distribution. The break-even share is relatively high. It's necessary to build out a distribution network before services can be sold, and that will require a larger market share. Legal restriction, the most serious, because we need a special license in each region, and there are dozens of regions in Vietnam. Many regional companies might have special links to regional government and get some kind of protection as well. Pharmacies. Again, this is a simple retail business. We open a shop and we start selling pharmaceuticals. very low entry and very low break-even market share required. Legal restrictions, very low, easy to enter. The temptation to renege on an implicit agreement increases the probability of price competition if things go wrong in the industry. It just takes one desperate or irrational company to decide to lower their prices in the hope of gaining volume. This can start a price war, and prices can spiral down to the zero profit level. This is more likely if there is low market growth. More companies become desperate when their absolute level of revenue is in decline. Vertical integration by buyers can result in negative growth for the independent companies, also leading to desperation. High capacity cost as opposed to fixed or variable cost. Having visible, empty, spare capacity does something to companies. It is very tempting for managers to lower the prices to fill up capacity. An empty seat in a plane taking off is lost revenue. Even just the $10 ticket price would be profitable for the airline. So if the capacity cost as a portion of total cost is high, reneging is more likely to take place. There is something that compels companies to make irrational action. And the above factors are especially important when there is an unclear pecking order, when the second-tier companies are large, chances are higher that one of them will fail. There isn't much potential for companies reneging on any industry order. First of all, market growth is high. That goes for manufacturing as well as the distribution stage. However, the independent distributors providing distribution services will not grow as fast as the industry because the manufacturers are often forward integrating into distribution. The cost of having a capacity is generally quite low. It's the highest in manufacturing, but still less than 10%. It is very helpful to try to quantify the scores on the 4 subdimensions and add them up to a total. I normally use 1 to 9 scale, where 1 is very low rivalry and 9 is very high rivalry. We can see here that distribution services sold to manufacturing has a very low degree of rivalry, and the highest rivalry we'll find in selling dried herbs to the manufacturers of traditional medicine. Bear with me a little bit longer. Now we'll look at buyer power. Strong negotiation power is something different from normal negotiation. Strong negotiation power means that most buyers are so large that they can directly influence the seller's price. In a normal negotiation, sellers have already factored in that there will be a negotiation. So the discounted price is basically the full price plus 10% minus 10%. There is strong negotiation power if there are few buyers and they have developed a sophisticated interaction between each other. It's much more difficult for buyers to get the same amount of coordination because buyers are in different industries, don't have a natural affinity for each other, and buy at different points in time. We have already looked at strong negotiation power in the quick method. High product differentiation increases product quality competition, but also reduces price sensitivity. When the buyer or the buyer's buyer prefers differentiated products, that normally leads to lower price sensitivity. Let's have a look at two different types of differentiated product or different types of product quality. The first types go under the technical name vertical differentiation. Some products are better than others, and most buyers would agree which products are better. The reason why buyers would settle for a less good product is that the less good product is cheaper. If there is high product quality sensitivity, a large portion of the buyers are interested in buying high quality products. That means that the number of companies in the consideration set is reduced, which tend to lead to lower price sensitivity. The second type is horizontal differentiation, which means that there are taste differences that play out when the price is held constant. Some people prefer product A and some people prefer product B because they have a different image, different branding, etc. If there are such taste differences, the number of companies is also reduced, the consideration set gets smaller, and price sensitivity becomes less pronounced. Product differentiation is more important for traditional. This is based on the fact that some end consumers have brand preferences. The preferences are there, not super strong, because they also trust the pharmacist's recommendation. In terms of product quality on both traditional and modern, there is a basic product quality requirement, but above the basic level of safety and containing the active ingredients, additional quality is less relevant. In the case of modern generics, a very small portion of the market require the branded generic products. The basic low importance of product quality sensitivity is also shown in distribution. Buyers are satisfied with distribution services that reach a basic level, that is, deliver the product to the desired destinations. Few value additional services, and there are no strong preferences for specific companies. In the case of buyers in the pharmacies, end consumers do not rank the quality of pharmacies because all pharmacies are very similar. End consumers often use the same pharmacy based on experience, so there is some preference for specific companies. Overall, some sub-industries have a medium amount of differentiation and others have a low amount. Lack of information and knowledge make buyers less price sensitive. It's expensive to gather price and quality information, and this can limit the buyer's amount of information processing prior to purchase. Instead of collecting more data, buyers can tend to satisfice. Satisficing means they buy a sufficiently good product. Price data is sometimes secret and sometimes time-consuming to collect, and sometimes it's freely available. Sometimes it's necessary for companies to do backward vertical integration to understand the cost structure of an earlier distribution or production stage. It's possible to estimate the information cost and relate it to the average purchase price. It then becomes apparent if the purchase price of a product is low, the information cost as a proportion can be quite high. When that happens, buyers satisfies. They make decisions based on existing product experience, advertising, salespeople, their social network, or they might assume their market share is a predictor of quality. What they don't do is price comparison. Some smart companies use this and charge per month instead of charging yearly. The second aspect is knowledge to evaluate the information. It's not sufficient to have information, we also need to know how to evaluate it. If the information is simply a price, $1 or $5, it's easy to evaluate. But if the product has multiple quality dimensions, it's difficult to relate the price and all the quality dimensions to what I, as a buyer, would like to have from the product. Buying a car is complicated because it has so many quality dimensions. It's even more difficult if there are hedonic benefits as opposed to just functional benefits. A car has mostly functional benefit, but there are also hedonic benefits in case of status, for instance. We can take an example showing the difficulty in evaluation. A Starbucks coffee costs $5 and a food court coffee costs $1. What's the value, the net value above the price paid for these products? It's a hard question to answer for most consumers. How much value is there in the Starbucks cup of coffee? If the value is $5, it's equal to the price, so the net value is zero. If your value is $4, you wouldn't buy it because the purchase price is $5. If you value the coffee to $6 gross and deduct the purchase price $5, the net value is $1, which happens to be equal to the cost of the coffee in the food court. These calculations are not natural for human beings. That's why we find it so difficult to answer the question, what is the value of a $5 cup of coffee? Hedonic benefits are very, very difficult to estimate, and when it's difficult to estimate, we don't do price competition. When it's difficult to estimate, we don't become price. I lost the thread there. When it's difficult to compare, we don't become. When it's difficult to compare, we become less price sensitive. Compare the recent coffee case with taking a train for €50 or flying for €100. This is a much easier evaluation because it's purely functional. The train is slightly slower, but it's half price from flying. Most people are able to evaluate the two quite well. Pharmacies have a large amount of information and knowledge. The salesmen from the manufacturers visit the pharmacies, so they have a full knowledge of pricing from all the competitors. This goes for traditional as well as for modern. It's even more important in modern because it's the most important sub-industry for the pharmacy, so they will pay more attention to it. There are more savings to be had by better sourcing modern generic medicine. The pharmacy has also great knowledge of how to evaluate different products. They are slightly less knowledgeable on the traditional medicine because they are sometimes not trained specifically in traditional medicine. In terms of distribution, the buyers of distribution services have some information, but they do not know the cost structure unless vertically integrated, which means they have a weaker bargaining position. And finally, pharmacies and end consumers. End consumers lack price information, few comparison shop, and it's time consuming to collect information. Often medicine is bought urgently, and often the amount is relatively small. So very little information and knowledge residing in the end consumer. We have looked at how product differentiation and lack of knowledge and information reduces price sensitivity. The third factor is switching costs, which also make buyers less price sensitive. Switching costs are associated with specific suppliers, and costs added associated with changing the supplier. Sometimes companies make specific investments that cannot be recovered. An airline that trained its pilots on Boeing planes need to retrain the pilots at a very high cost if they switch to Airbus planes. The same for the maintenance personnel. Long-term contract with costly exit clauses makes it harder to switch. Bureaucracy associated with changing suppliers. There might be administrative routines and tests and certain conditions for changing a supplier internally inside the large organization that make cost switching less likely, more costly. And finally, losing loyalty points built up over time. If loyalty points are lost and it takes time to get them, that could be another cost associated with existing suppliers. Note that this is not really loyalty to a supplier, it's more of a forced kind of loyalty associated with the financial benefit. Sometimes the cost could be psychological. The best example is the cost of breaking a habit. All of us have a bank, and many of us have had the same bank since we were children. Preference for certain brands, it is not a cost, but product differentiation. So we have to make the distinction between a switching cost associated with changing and actually wanting to keep the existing supplier. In the Vietnamese industry, switching costs are really non-existing, except possibly for some customers being used to go into their existing pharmacy, but that is even questionable. We are now in a position where we can summarize the result of the buyer power discussion. And it's important to keep in mind when we're talking about the industry, we are really talking about the buyers to the industry. So to traditional drug industry, the buyer power is the power of the pharmacies. So the strongest negotiation power lies with manufacturers buying dried herbs, as well as manufacturers buying distribution services. Differentiation is relatively less important. The most important differentiation power lies with the traditional drug manufacturers selling to pharmacies, and of course the pharmacies are echoing the brand demands from the end consumers. Trafaco, OPC have relatively strong brands on the traditional side. Information and knowledge. Here the customers in the pharmacies have the lowest amount of information and knowledge. They don't comparison shop and they don't know much about the products they are buying. The pharmacies have much more power because they have information and knowledge, especially on the generic side, which is the most important product category bought by the pharmacies. So they pay great attention and trying to understand which are the good products and what are the different price levels. Switching costs are not really relevant in any of these markets, but there might be a little bit of it in terms of habitual behavior of end consumers going to the same pharmacy over time. The net result is that the manufacturers have great bargaining power over the dried herb stage in the industry supply chain. Distribution services, buyers also have quite high power, but we should counter that with the very low amount of rivalry in the distribution services sub-industry. The end customers buying in pharmacies have very low buyer power, and there is relatively high rivalry in that industry. This table gives us the current situation. What is more interesting is to do a forecast of how these forces are likely to change in the future, which we will now turn to that effort. Forecasting is difficult, but it's the most important step in terms of value creation of the analysis. Here is my attempt to make a 20-year forecast. First, we should state that it's harder to forecast the speed of change than the direction of change. I expect relatively small changes in the next 10 years, but the general trend is that corporate buyers will be more consolidated and stronger. End consumers will be more knowledgeable, but will also come to value convenience. Larger changes will occur within the next 20 years. A market leader will emerge in traditional, reducing rivalry, but probably not in modern. Mom-and-pop pharmacies will eventually go extinct, but there will be quite fierce competition between the newly emerging chains before one or two of them come out as winners. Drying and grinding companies will mostly be acquired, and the remaining freestanding ones will see a bit more rivalry and a bit less buyer power. Distribution will remain exactly where it is and still be the most attractive sub-industry. Vertical integration is a side topic, but is of massive importance due to its commonality. Vertical integration is quite common, and we need a consistent way to deal with it in industry analysis. Let's take an example over half a century relating to food manufacturing and retail. In the 1950s, we had separate stages between manufacturing, wholesaling, and retailing. In this case, let's think about one national market. 5 manufacturers sell to 10 wholesalers who sell to 200 retailers. Analysis is very simple. Enter vertical integration. By 1970, 2 manufacturers have decided to merge, and 2 manufacturers acquire wholesalers, vertical integration. The retailers tend to consolidate through organic growth. One of the retailers buys a wholesaler. Barring the manufacturer merger, we still have exactly the same number of companies involved. It just so happened that some manufacturing and wholesaling is now done under joint ownership, and that company no longer participates in the market between manufacturing and wholesaling. So we need to remove those companies when we study the market. So we reduce 5 manufacturers to 4 manufacturers that are acting in the market, and then minus the one that merged, ending up with 2 manufacturers. The wholesalers, we started with 10 active in the market, but 2 merged and bypassed the market, so we only have 8. On the retailing side, 1 retailer merged with the wholesalers, so we have to deduct 1 retailer that's no longer participating in the market between wholesale and retail. At the same time, the wholesaler that was bought by the retail organization does not take part in the market either, so wholesaling goes down from 10 to 9. Fast forward to 1990. We have 3 mergers among the wholesalers, we have continued consolidation in retail, and 3 retailers now decide to buy wholesalers. The consolidation of the wholesalers through mergers make them more powerful, so the retailers decided to counter by in turn buying up wholesalers. The result of both vertical integration and mergers and acquisition is that we get fewer companies in each market. 2010. Now we get one combined manufacturer wholesaler merging with a retailer. We get one fully integrated company, and we see continuation in the consolidation in the retail sector. In real life, we also need to deal with different geographic scope of the market, as well as integration that is tapered, maybe half integration and half of the input goods bought in the market. To make that easier, let's look at another representation of the same information. It's sometimes useful to draw a company representation instead of activities. Here we have the 2010 situation, and we have divided it up into combined manufacturing wholesalers, combined retailing and wholesalers, and integrated companies. Of course, we have the remaining focused companies as well. This representation is identical to the activity representation. The way to think about markets in this case is to look at the 3 highlighted areas with an oval. The changes from 1950 to 2010. Well, manufacturing remains in a mutual bargaining situation, few number of sellers, few number of buyers. Wholesale went from a fairly high competition environment to one with low competition. We now only have 2 independent wholesalers selling to 15 retailers. Retail went from price competition to a combination of price and quality competition. Activities inside vertically integrated companies should be excluded from industry analysis. Vertical integration, however, can change rivalry and power in intermediate markets. So we need to take it into account when we look at the underlying factors. Change in the number of remaining sellers and buyers can shift the dynamics in the market. The pecking order can get stronger, or the buyers can gain strong negotiation power if they are concentrated enough. The company doing vertical integration will also increase its information and knowledge, which could make it more price sensitive. If I do a little bit of manufacturing myself, I know exactly how much the products should cost, and I can use that information when I negotiate with independent manufacturers. Vertical integration does take growth away from intermediate market. Even if the market is growing in the end customer stage, the intermediate market tend to disappear if more and more of the activities are done in vertically integrated companies. This means that the growth in the intermediate markets might decline and turn negative, which in turn can increase the temptation by some of the companies to engage in price competition. There can also be deconstruction of industry supply chains. Let's take the example of clothing manufacturing. In the 1970s, we had product design and manufacturing done by the same company. Fast forward to year 2000, 5 manufacturers decided to focus on product design and outsource manufacturing. 10 East Asian companies can provide outsourced manufacturing services. We suddenly have 55 manufacturing operations. That is 50 to start with, minus the 5 that stopped doing their own manufacturing, plus the 10 companies in East Asia doing outsourced manufacturing, 55. But the market between outsourced manufacturing and product design companies will only have 10 outsourcing companies and 5 buyers. Let's look at how the market could develop in 2030. The trend picks up and 20 additional manufacturers decide to follow. And we might get 4 mergers taking place among the East Asian companies. Now we have 6 East Asian companies offering outsourced manufacturing services and 25 companies willing to buy. Again, this is a simplified example looking at very simply at one Western country and the East Asian companies as one group of companies. This is a big simplification for illustration. Initially, the manufacturers outsourcing manufacturing have strong negotiation power. There are only 5 of them, and there are 10 sellers vying for their attention. This is strong negotiation power. This strong negotiation power disappears when more manufacturers decide to outsource manufacturing. Each individual buyer then becomes less important. The manufacturers have also, the outsourced manufacturing services companies have also consolidated, strengthening their bargaining position. The total amount of manufacturing remains stable, irrespective of whether it's done with all the product design manufacturing companies or independent outsourced manufacturing services companies. The same amount of clothing is produced, but there is growth in the market for outsourced manufacturing services. This backup slides highlight another complication. Different companies make different choices in terms of vertical scope. You should not do analysis for each type of company. Instead, you should focus on the sub-industries product markets identified in the previous slide. The vertical scope of an individual company is an important corporate decision that will be covered in a different video. Most of the presentation has dealt with price competition, but it's also important to mention product quality competition. So far, the whole presentation has been about price competition, which is the most serious type of competition. Product quality competition is also important, and it's at the highest at intermediate levels of rivalry. Some of the factors in the full model that influence price competition also influence product quality competition. First, moderate number of sellers. If we have too many sellers in the industry, there is basically too much price competition to enable companies to sit back, do R&D, and improve the product quality substantially. If there are too few sellers, there is complacency and companies tend to become very conservative. They don't have to do product quality competition because they have a good position, an oligopoly or market power position. Second, large a second tier challenging the first tier. Product quality competition often comes from runner-up companies that are more hungry and more on the edge. low entry barriers. Product quality innovation can also come from the outside, and if it's easy to enter the industry, we will see more innovation. And finally, product differentiation is highly valued by the buyers. Looking at the various sub-industries in the case study, we'll see that traditional has the potential for the highest product quality competition. The least product quality competition can be expected at the farming level as well as the distribution level. This presentation owes a great debt to Michael Porter's 5 forces model, which I also briefly want to touch upon. The 5 forces model was introduced to Harvard Business School students in the 70s and first written up in 1978. The model spread like wildfire to all business schools, consultancies, and companies. The origin is the so-called structure, conduct, performance model in industrial organization. Structure refers to factors that are hard to change in the medium term, for instance, market share. Conduct was a mediating variable. Structure determines conduct, and conduct determines performance. Hence, no need to study conduct. We can say structure determines performance. We have seen earlier that this is only half true. Economists like to have efficient markets. This is the research that Michael Porter turned on its head, and instead of looking for efficient markets, he said, how can we find inefficient markets? Inefficient markets from an econ speak means that companies make a lot of economic profit. The model is good but has some secondary weaknesses. As I said, structure is only the second most important factor, and focusing on maximizing profitability can lead a company to reduce value creation. The model has some 50 sub-factors, and the analyst must have a large experience to form a correct judgment about an industry. The critique has led many people to discard the 5 forces model, but I beg to differ. I hope this presentation on industry analysis had shown that it is still a very valuable and important endeavor. Porter's 5 forces model has, no surprise, 5 forces that can take profitability away from the industry. I like to think of them as evil forces. Here is the result of the evil forces at work. Suppliers have taken a big chunk of the money available. The rivalry is all over the place, and the coins are scattered around. Not a very attractive industry. Industry structure is the second biggest component in explaining profitability. Industry explains around 19%, and firm choices around 36%. The random component is large, 48%, and includes factors that are not stable over time. In other words, conduct matters much more than the economists in the 60s and 70s and 80s thought. Business schools are all about studying conduct. But after this research was published in the 1990s, many economists also started to look at conduct in more detail. After an hour and a half of dense information, we are ready to wrap up. The objective of industry analysis is to get an early warning on threats and opportunities. Company strategy must be adjusted as a result of the analysis. Let's have a final look at the pharmaceutical industry. There are great possibilities in the Vietnamese drug manufacturing and distribution dyad. Let's look at a few of them. The pharmacy industry will consolidate and chain pharmacies will appear, but the process will take time. Most mom-and-pop stores will eventually go out of business. Manufacturers could start chains, but more likely the chains will be started by outsiders. There is money to be made in consolidation. Modern drug manufacturing will be less and less attractive despite strong growth. Making pills is not very complicated and companies are not ready for R&D. Nevertheless, companies will invest hoping to make money because it's a growth industry, but they will be disappointed. Economies of scale will rule. The largest company, DHG Pharma, only has 10% today, so expect slow consolidation since many regional companies have local government support. There will not be much profitability in the industry even after consolidation. Some modern drug companies will diversify into traditional drugs, but will lack the required knowledge and will probably fail. Traditional drug companies must continually renew themselves and create more lifestyle products. The alternative is price competition. Trafaco is in a good position to take the lead and become a market leader that the other companies pay heed to. But there is a need to consider both core and extended product innovation. And finally, distributors are all state-run, bureaucratic companies. If number 2 or number 3 would use modern management techniques, it could be very profitable. Regional distributors will merge to create nationwide distribution networks. If successful, I do not expect them to greatly increase rivalry because there is a strong market leader. Some distributors might become specialists doing bulk purchasing on behalf of independent pharmacies. These are a few examples highlighted by the structural analysis. Good luck applying the models to your industry.